The cook came down off the noon coach with a wooden recipe box clutched against her chest in both arms, and she was weeping, not the loud kind, but the kind that has been carried too long and picks the worst possible moment to break free. The dry Wyoming wind lifted the dust off the boards of the Cedar Bend platform, and the platform went quiet around her the way a room goes quiet when something private spills out into it. She was a big woman, and the tears only made the worse, and she knew it, and still she did not set the box down to wipe her face. She had buried the last soul who ate from that box 11 months back. She had not meant to cry where the whole town could watch. If you have ever carried a grief into a room full of strangers and prayed your face would hold, if some part of you already wants to cross that platform and put an arm around her, then stay with me because her story is only beginning. Subscribe to this channel and ring the bell so the next one finds you. And drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. Then come back to Cedar Bend in the spring of 1882, because before the next sunrise, this weeping woman will set foot on a broken ranch, and one midnight will change the whole of it. Her name was Mara Hale, and the box held nearly everything she had left of a life. 3 years back, her husband had gone under a falling header beam at the flour mill in Council Bluffs, and she had buried him in the spring. The winter after that, the scarlet fever came through and took her daughter Sarah, who was 4 years old, and who had loved the molasses cookies, whose receipt was written in the box in Mara's own hand. After that, there was no reason to stay in Iowa and no money to stay anywhere, and when she saw the notice, a Wyoming rancher wanting a cook, $50 a month in a room, she had written back the same hour. The telegram that answered her had not asked one question about what she looked like. She would not have said aloud how much that had mattered. She had learned that certainty was a luxury, and she could not afford luxuries anymore. She could afford this one trunk and this one box and a stranger who needed his children fed. Cedar Bend did to her what towns did. She felt their eyes travel her, slow, top to bottom, the old measuring look that asked whether a body that size could clear a doorway. Then a man outside the feed store said, not bothering to lower it, that the new Holt cook? Lord, they sent for a whole herd. A laugh went up. Mara Hale wiped her face with the back of one hand, picked up her trunk with the other, and walked. She had learned a long time ago that stopping only gave them the pleasure of watching it land. The man who drove her the 9 miles out talked the whole way, the way some men do to fill a silence they find unbearable. Wyatt Holt don't say 2 words a week, he told her, not since his wife passed. Della, childbed fever, 2 springs back. Took her 4 days after the littlest girl was born, and folks say he ain't been right since. 2 young ones out there, and Bram Tolliver, here the driver spat, holds paper on that ranch and has been circlin' it like a buzzard waitin' on the last breath. 3 cooks come and gone since the snow, ma'am. None lasted the month. He looked sideways at her size, and seemed about to say something, and thought the better of it. The Holt ranch, when it came up over the rise, was worse than she had let herself expect. Not from idleness, she would understand later, but from grief which wears the same face. The kitchen garden had gone to thistle and gone to seed. 2 fence rails lay where they had fallen and stayed. A child's rope swing hung from the big cottonwood by one rope only, the other end frayed and trailing in the dirt, the way a thing hangs when the man who hung it stopped seeing it. And in the doorway of the house stood a small girl, perhaps 4 years old, with grave dark eyes, watching the wagon come, and the sight of her, exactly the age Sarah had been, exactly the height, knocked the breath clean out of Mara Hale. That was the second time she wept that day. She turned her face so the child would not see it and climbed down with her box. Wyatt Holt came out onto the sagging porch wiping his hands and did not offer one of them. He was tall and sunburnt and worn down to something quiet, and he spoke the way a man speaks who has decided words mostly cost more than they buy. You're the cook. It was not a question. Mara Hale, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she was. I cook, I bake, I keep a clean kitchen, and I don't make trouble. Your wire said 50 a month in a room. It did. He looked at her a moment, and whatever the town had taught him to expect, he did not say it. Boy's Thomas, he's 10 and he'll test you. Little one's Rosie, she don't talk to strangers. He paused at the word talk the way a man steps around a hole in the floor. Kitchen's through there. Don't expect much. The kitchen was its own confession. The stove was caked black with the burnt ghosts of 100 poor suppers cooked by men who did not want to be cooking. The flour in the open barrel had gone to weevils, and the basin smelled of standing water and something turned. A row of clean child-sized aprons hung untouched on a peg, folded by a man who plainly did not know what else to do with the things his wife had left. The neglect was not laziness. It was the visual language of a house where the person who made surfaces matter had been carried out the front door. Mara stood in it a moment with one hand pressed to the small of her own back. Then she rolled her sleeves to the elbow and began. The boy tested her, as promised. Thomas Holt watched her from doorways with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and on the second day he knocked the bowl of dough off the table to see what she would do. And what she did was hand him the broom and say, plainly, without heat, we share the floor, so we share the sweeping, and go on kneading the next batch as though nothing had happened. He swept. He glared the whole while, but he swept, and that was the first crack, though neither of them named it. She did not announce one thing she did, and that was the whole reason it worked. She turned the weevilled flour out and salvaged what she could, and found, in the spring house, a crock of sourdough gone gray and sleeping, which she fed back to waking over 3 patient days. She pulled the thistle out of the garden bed by the roots and turned the soil and planted what the season would still allow. She saw the way the littlest one rubbed at her chest in the cold mornings, the small barking cough of it, and traced it to the draft along the north wall, and stuffed the gap with rag and tallow without saying why. When one of the hands came in with a palm swollen and red-streaked from a fouled wire cut, she drew the poison out with a hot bread poultice and a needle she held in the lamp flame first, with a steadiness that made the big man go quiet, and after that 3 of the others took to bringing her their small hurts the way men will, once they have decided a woman can be trusted with them. She mended nothing loudly. She had never learned that trick. She only ever learned to do it. On the 3rd night she made the cookies. She knew what she was reaching for when she did it, though she would not have admitted it. The smell came first, the way it always had, molasses and clove and wood smoke filling that grim kitchen, until it stopped being a grim kitchen at all, until it became, for one evening, a place where somebody was alive and meant to keep being. The ranch hands came in off the range following the smell like men following a road home. They sat down to a proper supper, beef and biscuit, and the cookies after, and they ate the way bodies eat when they are remembering they are allowed to want a thing. And little Rosie, who had not said a word to Mara in 3 days, climbed up onto the bench beside her of her own accord, took a warm cookie in both small hands, bit, and got a look on her face she was far too young to hide, a startled, helpless pleasure, the look of a child remembering she is permitted to be glad. She ate it down to the last crumb and licked the molasses off her thumb and leaned, without seeming to decide to, against Mara's warm arm. And then she fell asleep there mid-chew the way only a small, safe child can. Mara did not move for a long while. Across the room, Wyatt Holt had stopped in the doorway with an armload of wood, and he stood there and did not set it down and did not speak, and the look that crossed his face was not one she was meant to see, so she did not turn. He put the wood down at last very carefully, as though it had become something breakable, and went back out into the dark. By the week's end he had begun to eat sitting down. It was a small thing, and it was not a small thing. For 2 years he had taken his meals standing at the counter with his back to the empty chair, the head of the table, the way a man eats a chore he resents needing. Now he came and sat and ate slow, and did not say the food was good, because saying it would have meant saying a great many other things he was not ready to say. But he came back for a second plate every night, and he stayed at the table a few minutes longer than the eating asked of him. Mara noticed. She did not remark on it. She had learned that the surest way to send a half-tamed thing back into the dark is to name the hour it begins to trust you. He never said one word about the cookies. But in the morning the second rope on the cottonwood swing had been mended and hung straight, and the 2 fallen fence rails were back up, and there was a great deal more split firewood by the kitchen door than 1 woman and 2 children could ever burn. He had not been asked for any of it. He did not mention it, neither did she. She had learned that a man like that does not answer kindness with words. He answers it with his hands, and a wise woman lets him. Bram Tolliver came over that week, all false neighborly warmth, and he measured Mara the way you measure a thing you intend to be rid of. He stayed for coffee he was not offered, and he looked around the bettered house and the turned garden with eyes that did not like what they saw, and on his way out he said to Wyatt, soft and friendly, that a widower alone with young ones and an unmarried woman under his roof gave the church ladies a great deal to talk about, and that talk had a way of reaching the county. and that a man wanting to keep his children and his land ought to think on how a thing looked. He tipped his hat to Mara and rode off. She read every word of him in the first minute and said nothing, because some men you do not warn, you simply wait. The fever came at midnight. 11 days in, Mara woke to a sound she knew. In her bones, the sound she had prayed 11 months never to hear again. A small child fighting for air. Rosie was burning, her breath gone tight and crowing, the croup riding in on a fever that had climbed while the house slept. And Mara Hale, who had once sat helpless by a bed and learned everything too late, was not helpless now. She knew this. God help her. She knew exactly this. She built the fire roaring and set every kettle on it and made the kitchen thick with steam. And she held the child upright against the warm bulk of herself so the small chest could pull. And she dosed the fever down with the cool cloths and the steam and the steady low sound of her own voice, hour after hour, the way you tend a fire you cannot let go out. Twice the small breath nearly stopped, and twice she coaxed it back, talking low the whole while, not to the child, who was past hearing her, but to herself, the way a person keeps her own hands from shaking. The clock on the shelf struck 2, then 3, then 4. Thomas would not leave. The boy who had glared at her from doorways sat the whole night on the floor at her knee, wringing out cloths, fetching water, not testing her now, only watching her save his sister with a fierce, silent need. And in the doorway stood Wyatt Holt, gripping the frame with both hands, white to the lips, because this, a fever taking a child of his in the night, was the exact shape of the thing that had taken Della, and he could not make himself come into the room. He stayed in the doorway the whole night long like a man at the edge of a grave. Near dawn the fever broke. Rosie's breath came loose and easy, and the crowing stopped, and the child slept, truly slept, the long even sleep of the living, and Mara laid her down and finally let her own hands shake. Thomas had fallen asleep against her side, and Wyatt Holt came at last into the room and knelt by the bed and put one rough hand against his daughter's cool, damp forehead, and then he said, low, in a voice that had kept a thing locked 2 years and felt the lock give all at once, Della had a fever like that after Rosie came. 4 days I watched her burn, and there wasn't a thing I could do but watch. He stopped. His jaw worked. I couldn't ever look at the baby right after. I knew it was a sin, and I couldn't help it. I lost the one and got handed the other in the same week, and I've been no kind of father to that little girl. And tonight she'd have died in my house while I stood in a doorway too afraid to walk through it. He looked up at Mara. You walked through it. Mara did not tell him it was not his fault. She did not reach for him or fill the silence with comfort, because she had learned that some weights a person must set down himself, and hands laid on too soon only make him grip harder. She reached past him instead and tucked the blanket up under his sleeping daughter's chin, and she stayed there, kneeling beside him in the gray light, which was its own kind of answer, the kind that says, I am here, and this is real, and I am not going to pretend it is anything smaller than it is. That was the midnight that changed the ranch. Everything after it turned on that one night, though the worst of the trouble had not even come yet. What no one saw was Mara herself. An hour later, when the house had gone quiet and the children slept and Wyatt had finally lain down, she went out onto the dark porch and put her back against the cold boards of the wall and let it come. All of it, the whole 11 months of it, Sarah's small hot hand, and the bed she had not been able to save, and the molasses smell of a kitchen with no child left to bake for. She wept the way she had not let herself weep on the platform in front of the town. She wept for the daughter she had lost, and for the one she had just kept, and how those two could live in the one body at the same hour she would never understand. It lasted the length of one hard cry. Then she dried her face on her apron, and stood up off the wall, and went back inside to bank the fire, because there was a household to feed in the morning, and she had learned that grief, however large, does not excuse a body from the work of the living. It came 9 days later, and it came in town because Bram Tolliver had finally moved. He had the note in his hand, $600 due, and Wyatt short of it. And he had been to the county, and he had filed a petition asking that the Holt children be removed to proper care on the grounds that their father was unfit and his household a scandal, with an unmarried woman living under his roof and a child near dead of neglect in his charge not 2 weeks past. He had timed it so the hearing fell the same morning the note came due, meaning to take the children and the land in one stroke, before the whole assembled town. He had not counted on what one midnight had done to a frozen man. Wyatt Holt had used few words his whole life, and he used fewer now, and he used them in front of every soul in Cedar Bend who had ever looked at Mara Hale sideways. He stood up in that crowded county room when Tolliver finished his patient, sorrowing speech, and he did not make a speech of his own. "My girl had the croup and a fever in the night," he said. "She'd be in the ground this morning if Mara Hale hadn't sat up with her till dawn and pulled her through it. That's the neglect this man's talking about. He let it sit on them. I'm short on his note. I won't pretend I'm not. But I'll be hanged before I let a buzzard tell this town I can't raise my own children with the only person in 9 miles who ever fought to keep one of them alive." He sat down. He had said all he meant to. The doctor stood then, because after that he could do nothing else, and told the room plainly that the Holt girl had been within an hour of dying, and that the cook's quick hands were the whole reason she had not. The ranch hands stood, all 6 of them, and said they would not work for a better-fed table in the territory. And when it came to the note, the banker out of Cedar Bend, a decent man who had watched Tolliver grasp at half the valley for a year, looked at the town now standing solid behind Wyatt Holt and extended the paper 90 days at his own discretion, which was a thing a banker does only when the wind has plainly changed. The county judge, who had heard a great many petitions in his years on the bench, and could tell a guardianship plea from a land grab dressed up to look like one, peered at Bram Tolliver over his spectacles and asked him one question: whether it was the children's welfare that had brought him in that day or the $600 falling due that same morning. And the silence Tolliver gave back answered it for the whole room. The petition was dismissed from the bench. Bram Tolliver walked out of that room with neither the children nor the land nor the goodwill of one neighbor in it, exposed before the whole county for exactly the carrion bird he was. Some of the town changed its face toward Mara that morning. Some only went silent, beaten, which in a town like Cedar Bend amounts to the same thing. None of them measured her in the street again. The ranch came back the way land comes back after a hard winter, slowly and then all at once. The garden gave beans and squash by August. The swing hung straight from both ropes, and Arusi used it every evening, healthy and loud and forever underfoot in the kitchen, narrating the world to anyone who'd hear. Thomas, who had once knocked a bowl to the floor to test her, took to calling her Mama without ceremony one ordinary afternoon, as though he had been doing it all along, and Mara had to step out to the porch a moment before she could answer him. Wyatt paid the note in the fall off a good cattle sale, and that winter, with no fanfare and few words, because he was a man of few, he asked Mara Hale to stay for good, and she did. The recipe box sits open on the kitchen counter now every morning. It is full again. New receipts and a child's careful hand crowded in among the old ones. Sarah's molasses cookies still there in Mara's writing, made fresh every week for a different little girl who has decided they belong to her. Mara opens it now without weeping. She arrived in this country with that box held against her chest like the last of everything, and she had been told her whole life that she was too much, too big, too plain, too much trouble, too much woman for any decent man to want. She had finally come to a place that knew there was no such thing as too much of a person. 22 years on, in the autumn of 1904, Rosie Holt was married in the yard under the same cottonwood, and her brother Thomas stood up beside her, and half of Cedar Bend came out in its Sunday best to bear witness, because some lessons a town learns and keeps. Mara stood at the edge of all of it with both hands folded easy over an apron she had long since stopped apologizing for. She did not need the valley's leave to belong there. She had stopped asking permission the night she walked through a doorway a grieving man could. Not, she knew exactly who she was, and she filled every inch of the life she had earned, and she was not going anywhere.